Good morning, guten Tag, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in whichever part of the world you are in. Thanks for joining. As you know, and you can see, there are many other participants now, additional participants. Of course, Diamanten are there from our project team, but of course, many more participants because we had opened this lecture also for other institutes and students. I'm very happy that this is the ninth lecture now in our series, series of the Umbrella Project, Diamantenschliff, the Digital Translation Academy of Goethe-Institut South Asia 2023, 6 a.m. EST, 12 p.m. CET, and last lecture of this year. Today's lecture is about translation and multilingual slash multicultural competence, the Indian tradition and experience. This talk aims to give an overview of the Indian situation in which translations or transcreations are undertaken since centuries with the multilingual and multicultural competence on the part of the translator. So the talk points out to the differences between the Indian and European cultures when it comes to the concept, expectations, and norms about translations, and pleads for an intercultural approach. The speaker is Professor Dr. Ridagiri Ganeshan. We know him very well. Now, of course, our respondent and moderator, Dr. Milind Brahme, will introduce Dr. Ganeshan. Since there are many new participants today in this meeting, I will quickly introduce Dr. Milind Brahme. He is at present at IIT Madras. He studied German at Ferguson College, Pune, and Center of German Studies, JNU, New Delhi. He completed his PhD in 1997. It was a comparative study of the literary work of the Marathi writer G.A. Kulkarni and Franz Kafka. Milind has been a recipient of numerous scholarships. He has presented papers at many international seminars and conferences, also in India. He taught at JNU, and he is at present teaching courses in German language and literature, literary theory and criticism. He is DAAD, that is German Academic Exchange Service Research Ambassador for South Asia for the Humanities and Social Sciences for the period 2022 to 2025. Milind has been associated with the Goethe Society of India since its inception. Milind had edited the 2007 volume of the Goethe Society's yearbook titled Translation as Cultural Praxis. Milind is also involved in studying and evaluating pedagogical interventions and innovations in school education. He has been part of successful research initiatives in the area of multi-grade, multi-level, and inclusive education. So now, against this background, you'll agree with me, Milind, as an accomplished translator, a Germanist, a scholar with high intellectual ability and independent thinker, he's the most suitable and respondent and moderator for today's session. Over to you, Milind. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayashree, for the kind introduction again. And Professor Ganeshan, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually, though, after a long time, I think, after a few years we are meeting. And many thanks for agreeing to do this, this lecture, which is the last lecture of this series that Jayashree and Manasi have organized for the Digital Translation Academy. I'm very happy to respond today to Professor Ganeshan's lecture later on. And it's my pleasure and honor now to introduce him to the audience. As Jayashree said in the beginning, we, most of us, especially in the German studies discipline, we know Professor Ganeshan very well. He's one of the most senior-most professors of this discipline. But for those who have joined and those who are not from the German studies discipline, I'll just give a very brief introduction. I'm making it brief here because his accomplishments are several, and I'm just going to mention a few things here as introduction before I hand over the evening to Professor Ganeshan. Professor Dr. Ridagiri Ganeshan studied Hindi literature, history, and political science at Osmania University in Hyderabad. and then Germanistik and Internationale Politik at the Uni München, from where he obtained both his MA as well as his DPhil. He also has a Sprachlehrer Diplom from the Goethe-Institut München. His fields of specialization are German studies, methods of teaching German as a foreign language, and cross-cultural communication. And I still remember, I mean, if I may add a personal note, that I had invited him to IIT Madras once, where he did give a very well-received talk on transcultural communication, intercultural communication. He was from 1975 to 2007 professor of German at the Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages, now English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, and was also its vice chancellor from 1996 to 97, and again from 2004 to 2005. He taught German language, German literature, and methods of teaching German as a foreign language, and trained teachers of German and English during the 32 years of his academic career in India. Since 2019, he is Emeritus Professor of German at the IIS deemed to be University in Jaipur, Emeritus Professor and also Academic Advisor for Roseland Academy, USA, and Roseland English Medium School, Jhargaon in India. He has published 2 books in German, namely Das Indien Erlebnis Hermann Hesses, which was published in 1972, and Das Indienbild Deutscher Dichter 1900 in 1975, both published in Bonn by Bouvier. And he has over 100 articles in professional journals, both in India and abroad. And he has also presented papers at numerous international conferences. I mean, so I'm saying that this is a very brief introduction. And Professor Ganeshan, once again, it's a pleasure to listen to you again. And without further ado, I will hand over the microphone virtually to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, dear friends, I would like to thank the Goethe-Institut, Max Mueller, Mumbai, for me, personified by Ms. Jayashree Joshi and Ms. Mansi Bapat, for inviting me to be part of the translation project as mentor for Tamil, and also for inviting me to give this lecture today without seeing that popular movie song in Hindi, Mere Angane Mein Tumhara Kya Kaam Hai. I am also very happy to see Milind after a long time, and I am very happy that he is going to be the respondent for my talk. I would like to preface my talk with the following words of the German poet Hermann Hesse. Meine Aufgabe ist es nicht, anderen das Objektiv Beste zu geben, sondern das meine so rein und aufrichtig wie möglich. In English, my task is not to give others objectively the best, but whatever is mine as plainly and sincerely as possible. As it is nowadays fashionable to start with a disclaimer, I want to put in a small disclaimer. Looking at me, many of you may start thinking that a famous politician in India resembles me. I don't resemble him. But the disclaimer is, I am not a part of any political party. I don't believe in Narastuti. Okay, all human beings are equal, not only in the eyes of God, also in my eyes. Now don't say, oh my God. Therefore, whatever I'm going to tell you, it is the views of an Indian who is very proud to be an Indian and who is convinced that he need not prove his patriotism to anybody. I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to offer a big theory. I am a different kind of professor. I strongly believe in, I continue to believe in, as we say in German, Theorie belehrt, Praxis lehrt. That means theory preaches and practice teaches. As a teacher trainer, the practice was more important for me than any theory. Another thing I'm not going to do is, I'm not going to use any PowerPoint. I'm a teacher of the old school. My Google is in my head and not only in my laptop. I do have enough knowledge and a little bit of wisdom about the world, which means I have the required power in me to make my point, so I don't need PowerPoint. Our topic is translation and multilingual, multicultural competence, the Indian tradition, the experience. First of all, let me explain to you what qualifies me to give this talk. Because with all the social media nowadays, everybody talks about everything possible. Most of the medical advice you get on YouTube is from people who are not medical doctors at all. What qualifies me to give this talk? I speak only 10 languages. Tamil, it is Tamil and not Tamil, or some people enthusiastically write in German Tamilish. There's nothing like that. Tamil is my mother tongue. It's my first language, my actual eyes through which I look at the world around me. I have in fact learned several other Indian as well as non-Indian foreign languages, and I do think that I have learned all of them quite effectively. All these other languages are in reality my contact lenses, which have helped me to look and understand different cultures and thus broaden my understanding of the world from a cross-cultural perspective, and I'm happy about it. As you all know, operating in a multilingual environment is part of day-to-day life in India. When I used to live and work in India till 2007, now I live in Atlanta, in the US. What was my daily routine? This was my daily routine in India. I spoke at home with my family members my mother tongue Tamil. At my workplace, at the Central Institute of English and Foreign Languages in Hyderabad, I spoke with my colleagues, both academic as well as administrative, mostly English and partly German. In the evening, I spoke to the vegetable vendor in Telugu. After seeing a Hindi movie at a theater, we went for dinner to a Udupi restaurant and I ordered my food in Kannada. To get back home, we took an auto rickshaw and I spoke to the auto rickshaw driver in Urdu. In the night, I used to then read a scholarly article written by a German expert in which this person, in spite of being monolingual and knowing only German, still took the liberty of offering me didactical strategies as to how to teach German as a foreign language in India. Using the knowledge of all the languages I had learned and putting in hard work and not looking for shortcuts like it's done nowadays, I was slowly able to build up a meaningful career as a Germanist and was also in the process was able to gain a little bit of international reputation in the field of German studies. That is my Aadhaar card. Even now, I interact daily with people from different parts of India and people from different countries of the world in several languages. I also have a little bit of experience in translating literary text. In all modesty, I'd also like to inform you, because translation and interpretation go together. In all modesty, I would like to inform you all that at the 1972 Olympics in München in Germany, I was an official interpreter across English, several Indian languages, and German. I hope all this qualifies me to give this lecture. The world seems to be so fragmented and divided that any broad consensus when it comes to a discussion on language and literature seems next to impossible. Anandavardhan said in his Dvanyaloka, there are bound to be plenty of coincidences amongst great minds, but all of them should not be taken by the wise as being identical. Going by the essence of these wise words of Anandavardhan and by the traditional Asian Indian discourse, I would like my talk to be considered in all modesty as nothing but a long quotation from all that what I have read, constantly learned and published till now in my life, and an unpretentious attempt to add as an Indian teacher a little bit of my own thinking to our discussion from a cross-cultural perspective. Now let us jump into our topic. The word translate comes from Latin translatio, where Trans means across and latus means carrying. The word thus means the carrying across of meaning from one language to the other. When we look for a comparable word for the English word or the Latin word translation in Indian languages, then we find not just one word but several words. But they do not convey the same meaning as in Latin or English. These words are, to give only a few of them, anuvad, to speak after, bhashantar, linguistic transference, tarzuma, reproduction, rupantar, change of form, vivarthanam, change or transformation, and mozhi matram, change of script. Interestingly, all these concepts do not necessarily demand loyalty to the original as the European concept of translation does. The Indian tradition describes the process of translation as transcreation. In this process, the translation becomes, rather than a docile transference of meaning from one linguistic system to the other, a culturally creative retelling, a transcreation by the translator into another language. There has been a proliferation of translation theories in the West. On the contrary, Indians seem to have been so constantly engaged in translation activities since centuries that they did not worry about theorizing everything about it. India is well known as a multicultural and a multilingual country with more than 1 billion inhabitants. The affiliation to a language community plays in the psychological mindset of an Indian an important role, since this offers him or her a lifelong important identity. India has always been a rich and proud multilingual and multicultural society. Many Indians have been and continue to be bilingual and very often multilingual, something you do not find as a rule in the European and North American cultures and countries even today. Day-to-day life in India is a constant process of what linguists will call it's a constant process which the linguists will call interlingual translation. Most of the Indians act and react in several languages in their day-to-day interactions with everyone around them. With so many languages and literatures in the country, there has been an extensive exchange of linguistic knowledge and literary wisdom within India. There have been quite a number of poets in India who grew up in a bilingual and multicultural environment. These poets not only spoke and wrote in the mother tongue, but also in other languages. This applies not only for the written literatures, but also for the oral literatures, which have a lively existence even today. Here are some examples. Namdev was born in Maharashtra and spoke Marathi, but one finds his songs in Guru Granth Sahib in Punjabi. Mirabai built a musical bridge between Rajasthani and Gujarati through her songs on God Krishna. Raja Sarfoji from Maharashtra composed music dramas in Tamil called Kuravanji. Swati Tirunal from Kerala, where they speak Malayalam, has written dramas and songs in Hindi and Sanskrit. Vidyapati was oscillating between Bihari and Bangla. This list can be continued in today's literary scene also. So what has been the Indian traditional experience in the context of multilingual competence and translation? Every language is unique and is connected to a particular culture. Therefore, the words in one language may not be able to express what the words in another language are saying. There is always an inbuilt meaning in every word of every language depending on the cultural context and connotation. That is why it's next to impossible to capture and express the thoughts from one language in another language. Obviously, different languages motivate and condition their speakers to think differently and thereby perceive the world differently. That's what we're all doing. The inbuilt meaning has to be captured and expressed appropriately in any kind of translation from one language into another. Translation is therefore not simply a matter of seeking equivalent words with similar meaning, but of finding appropriate ways of saying things in another language. Let me give you two examples from Sanskrit. There is a word called ahimsa. Ahimsa is usually translated as non-violent and is taken to mean not hurting anyone physically. For example, many vegans use the word ahimsa in the context of their not hurting or not wanting to hurt animals. But actually, the word ahimsa includes not hurting with words and in thought, not only physically. Take the word vairagya. In the Yoga Sutra, vairagya usually is translated as dispassion. It is introduced along with abhyasa or intensive practice as an essential tool for life. But actually, vairagya literally means growing pale. That is, we are colored by our desires, and when we learn to give away the things we are clinging to, we grow paler and paler and more translucent until we reach a point where the light just shines right through us. Therefore, the word dispassion doesn't tell us exactly what is vairagya. The process of transmitting cultural elements through literary translation is a complicated and vital task, and I'm sure that most of the translators in this project have learned this valuable lesson by now. Culture is a complex collection of various kinds of experiences in life, which do condition our daily life. Culture includes various important aspects like traditional values, social structures, customs and manners, and also religious beliefs. Every language is culturally unique. Therefore, one cannot expect that one language can express a particular content the same way another language may choose to express it. If you will ask me what is Guten Tag in Indian languages, what is good morning? Standard reply you get even from people teaching German is Suprabhat. Or Tamil they say Kale Vanakkam. That's not correct. The question is, when the Germans say Guten Tag in their culture, what do we say in our culture? Therefore, the correct translation of Guten Tag in Indian languages will be Namaste. Different languages do use different linguistic structures, but that's only the formal aspect of two language systems. Translation is therefore not simply translating sentences from one language word by word into another language, but finding appropriate ways of expressing the content in another language from an intercultural perspective. One of the main goals of particularly literary translation is to initiate the target language reader into the sensibilities of the source language culture. Caught between the need to capture the cultural content of the base language and the necessity to facilitate the readers in the target language through the translation one does, it is vital that the translator has to be well versed in both the languages and be aware of the uniqueness of both the cultures. Consequently, any translation should be able to effectively offer the cultural meaning intricately woven into the text by the original author using his creative skills. An ideal translator should be aware of both the cultures because transmitting cultural elements through literary translation is a complicated process, and unfortunately, it is being underestimated by many translators in India. If you are attempting to translate literary text from one language into another, ask yourself honestly whether you have this essential cross-cultural knowledge and communicative competence in both the languages to handle the challenging task. Compared to the European concepts and theories of translation, India's translating consciousness has been different from that of Europe. The Indian tradition describes the process of translation as transcreation. This is a process whereby the translation, rather than a docile transference of meaning from one linguistic system to the other, becomes a culturally creative retelling by the translator in another language. Indian tradition does not lay undue stress on originality, but puts the writer's capacity to transform, translate, restate, and revitalize the original text. Tulsidas' Hindi retelling of Ramayana and Ganeshwar's free Marathi translation of Bhagavad Gita are the epitomes of the characteristic Indian tradition of translation, marked unequivocally by ideological shifts and radical subversions. The repetitive, explanatory, illustrative, corroborative, and interpretative connotations of the term anuvad reveal that to the Indian society is steeped in oral literary traditions of smriti and shruti. Differing versions were the norms rather than exceptions. That's why you see people don't write interpretations on Indian literary texts. The tradition has been you write a bhashyam. A bhashyam is a personal commentary on that literary text, the way you have perceived the text. And there are so many bhashyams available on a particular text, and it is left to you to choose what you think helps you to access the original text. Take Bhagavad Gita. There is a commentary by Radhakrishnan. There is one by Vinoba Bhave and other people also, several people. So if you want to get access to Bhagavad Gita, you choose one of those commentaries as the medium, as a tool to get into Bhagavad Gita and try to understand it. So in India, literary works have been transferred from one language to another, usually in such a way that each time a new literary work has been created in the target language. In view of the unique and different linguistic possibilities offered by the target language, the content of the original work has often been reproduced in a different form, whereby the original, to say it in the Indian way, was reborn. It was a punarjanma in the target language in the sense of transcreation. From the outset, it was assumed that loyalty to the original, as the European concept prescribes, cannot and should not be the first priority, since it was about rewriting the original in another language for readers from another culture. The translator, the anuvadak, as the transcreator, had the responsibility and at the same time the freedom of creativity, the freedom to creatively translate a literary work from one language into another, keeping in mind the cultural differences between the base and the target language. Thereby, the anuvadak had to use his common sense and wisdom and in a way to interpret the literary work from slightly a different point of view than that of the author himself. At the same time, Anuvadak made sure that his translation had the same elevating effect on the readers in the target language as the original offered to the reader in the source language. Translation was therefore an artistic activity and not an artificial and mechanical one as people are doing it today, unfortunately. Transcreation in the Indian context has never been an art, but a craftsmanship. Since one wanted to recognize and appreciate the individual accomplishment of the poet or the author, one avoided any discussions on the transcreation. That's what I explained to you with the word bhashyam. One avoided discussions on the transcreations by applying so-called objective criteria as they do it in the West, thereby attempting to critically judge and tear the transcreation into pieces using academic jargon. The readers, as well as the literary critics, the literary critic was called Sahriday. Sahridai means similar heart. So, the literary critic put himself psychologically into the soul of the author and tried to understand what the author is trying to say. So, the Sahridai, the readers as well as the literary critics, benevolently accepted the transcreation as new literary works, enjoyed them, and recommended them to others, sometimes without even knowing or getting to know the original text. Each transcreation thus meant an extension of the original using the linguistic and cultural possibilities the respective target language offered. Based on this conviction, the two great national epics of India, Ramayana and Mahabharata, have been transcreated, not translated, into various Indian languages. Each resulting work in the respective Indian language can thus claim a certain literary value for itself. There are several transcreations of the Indian epic Ramayana by Valmiki, originally written in Sanskrit language into different Indian languages by various Indian poets. The first interlingual translation of the Ramayana was in the 4th century AD by Paumacharya. The Jain version was written by Vimal Suri. It was a translation from Sanskrit to Prakrit. This was an anti-Brahmanical text where Ravana is not a monster or Hanuman is not a monkey. This also reveals how translations can be original creations marked by the ideology of the translator and the target culture. Bhatti's Bhatti Kavyam, written in the 7th century AD, was a retelling in Sanskrit itself. These are some of the transcreations of Ramayana in different Indian languages. We have Geeti Ramayan in Assami by Durgavara, Ramcharit Manas in Hindi by Tulsidas, Pampa Ramayan in Kannada by Nagachandra, Ramavatar Charitra in Kashmiri by Prakash Rama, Vilanka Ramayan in Odia by Sarladas, Adhyatma Ramayanam in Malayalam by Ezhuthachan, Bhavartha Ramayana in Marathi by Eknath, Kamba Ramayanam in Tamil by Kamban, and Vashishta Ramayana in Telugu by Madiki Singana. The other famous Indian epic, Mahabharata by Vyasa, originally written in Sanskrit, was also transcreated in various Indian languages. This happened between 11th and 15th centuries. In Assami by Harihara Vipra, Kaviratna Saraswati and Rama Saraswati. In Bangla by Kashiram Das and Kabi Sanjay, who transcreated into Bangla for a rural readership. In Kannada by Naranappa and Tamanna and Pampa, who in his Vikramarjuna Vijayam retold the story from the point of view of Jainism. In Malayalam by Ezhuthachan as Mahabharatam Kilipattu. In Marathi by Kopteshwara, Sridhara and Moropat. In Odia by Sarladas, 15th century, and Sarladas edited out. He left out Bhishma Parva completely, with the result that his version of Mahabharata does not have Bhagavad Gita in it. In Tamil by Pugazendi and Villiputturar. In Telugu by Nannaya Tikkanna Errapragada, known as Erranna, and also by Adarvana, whose Bharatamu was a Jain version of the epic. What all these translations, actually transcreations, retellings, have done is to instill faith in the target readership. The changes that can be seen in these versions are the changes that the source text has to undergo in the context of its target or receptor culture. All of them have, however, maintained equivalence in terms of the rasa they evoke in the reader, but none of them has carried over Valmiki's literal meaning embedded in his Ramayana or Vyasa's in his Mahabharata. If you take Valmiki's Ramayana, Ravan takes away Sita by holding her hair. He just lifts her up and takes her away, kidnaps her, today we'll say. Whereas in Tamil, Kamba Ramayana, Tamil culture does not allow you to touch a parastri without her permission. Nowadays, even touching one's own wife has become a problem. And that's good so. In Tamil Ramayanam, what Ravan does is he digs the earth on which Sita is standing and carries the entire earth along with Sita to Sri Lanka. That was the Indian tradition of transcreation. As India passed into the medieval period, the influence of Sanskrit started declining. The various invasions during this period also brought with them different cultural and linguistic influences. Let's not do this mistake of thinking that Sanskrit is the only Indian tradition. No. Because the various invasions, we call them invasions today, but very often when people came to India, we welcomed them. We let everybody in those days. We should have resisted them that time. And that's why a certain discourse which is happening today is unacceptable to me. So that period also brought different cultural linguistic influence. Persian, Farsi became the dominant language because it was the language of the court. It is also considered to be the elite language of scholarship under the Mughal rulers. The Mughal courts had scholars who were also translators. Babar Nama, the autobiography of Babar, was originally written in a language called Chagtai, but was translated into Persian by Humayun's minister Bairam Khan. Akbar commissioned translations of Sanskrit works in Persian. The Mahabharata was translated to Persian during Akbar's time. His great-grandson, Dara Shah, translated the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita into Persian. Translations in this period had many important results. Let us not deny that. Firstly, it encouraged and helped people to become bilingual and in many cases, ultimately multilingual. Secondly, it gave rise to new languages like Urdu, which was the result of the interaction of Persian with local languages. Thirdly, translations from other languages had the effect of introducing new literary genres to India. For example, translations from Persian, Farsi, brought in new genres like Masnavi, Qasida, and importantly, the Ghazal. They were Indianized to suit the local reader's taste. Mirza Ghalib, the most important Ghazal writer, wrote in Persian and also in Urdu. Fourthly, many Indian texts reached the West through Persian translations. As is the case with most texts, there are no accurate written records about these, which makes tracking them down difficult. But we can say without hesitation that translations help to make Indian culture what it is today, a happy blending of multiple cultural influences, and we should be proud about it. With the advent of English, the context and role of translation in India changed radically. The translation landscape morphed rapidly into a thoroughly new scenario of the British colonization. A good share of the positive, creative atmosphere of the transcreational activities carried out before the colonial days seems to have been shattered by colonial experience. English became the dominant language. When India was colonized by the British, they initially attempted to establish that the English language and literature were superior to all the Indian languages and literature put together. But it's also important for the British to know the local languages, as matters of administration had to be in Indian languages. They had to know India well to govern it better. So, there was also a reverse movement of translation from India to England and to Europe. Sir William Jones, founder of the Asiatic Society, translated Abhigyana Shakuntalam of Kalidasa into English in 1789. Charles Wilkins, official translator of Persian and Bengali to the Commissioner of Revenue of the East India Company, was the first one to translate the Bhagavad Gita into English in 1784. These translations had official blessings as they were undertaken with the specific purpose of helping the British to know India better, to rule India effectively. However, these translations could not successfully convey the cross-cultural nuances and therefore offered footnotes and glossaries for the European reader. This practice of offering footnotes and glossaries continues even today. It is in fact expected from the Indian translators. Whenever a literary work from an Indian language is translated into European languages. The other way, this is not done. Ask yourself why. The idea that the literary translation should remain faithful to the original seems to have been introduced in India by the Christian missionaries who wanted the Bible to be translated into Indian languages. The Bible translations in India have contributed to a limited extent to the target languages, but no Indian Bible edition can match as an effective translation the German Bible of Martin Luther. The Bible did not per se enrich the Indian languages, but in the philological area, it indirectly influenced the Indian scenario. You know, most of the dictionaries in Indian languages, they were compiled by the Europeans actually. But the Bible translations by the Christian missionaries did bring in the gift of the art of printing into the Indian literary scene. And thanks to this, books in Indian languages could also be printed in India. Something interesting happened when works of English literature were translated into Indian languages. Shakespeare's plays were translated in some Indian languages in late 19th and early 20th century. These translations were essentially transcreations done by Indians. They did radically Indianize Shakespeare's plays in terms of plot, characters, place and time, and even genre. Bharatendu Harishchandra's translation of The Merchant of Venice is a case in point. Not only does Bharatendu change the names of the central characters, but he kind of changes the binary of racial animosity from Christian to Jewish people to Hindu and Jains. Furthermore, Shakespearean tragedy had to undergo conceptual overhaul in addition to linguistic and cultural one. The genre of tragedy, being unknown to Indian mind, had to be given a happy ending by the translator. I'm sure Shakespeare would not have liked it. What happens to a literary work in an Indian language when it is translated into English? When a literary work in Indian language is translated to English, there are also certain interesting things which happen. I'm going to give you two examples. Rabindranath Tagore's the Nobel Prize winning Gitanjali was translated by the poet himself. This act of self-translation, however, also made him the subject of criticism. It's by now relatively well known that the English Gitanjali is not the direct translation of the original Bangla anthology. Tagore combined verses from his other Bangla works like Naivedya, Khaya, and Gitimalya to form the English Gitanjali. It had a decidedly pronounced mystical element in the English version, which was calculated to appeal to the Western reader's taste. Rabindranath Tagore described the self-made translation of his lyrical work Gitanjali, which earned him the Nobel Prize in 1913, translation done by the author himself. W.B. Yeats, who did not know the Bangla language, justified the inclusion of Tagore as a notable translator in the anthology Oxford Book of Modern Verses, 1892 to 1935. But Reverend Edward Thompson, who did not know a little bit of Bangla at all, to compare the Bangla original to the English version, made in his treatise, Rabindranath Tagore, Poet and Dramatist, London 1926, he pointed out in his treatise that the translation did differ from the original in several aspects. Here, we have the case of an Indian poet who created a transcreation of his own work from the Bangla into English, but offered it to the unsuspecting European readers as translation not as transcreation in the European sense. Another example is Narayana Menon's English translation of the Malayalam novel Chemmeen by Thagazhi Sivashankaran Pillai. Narayana Menon allowed himself quite a bit of freedom as translator when he did this. Narayana Menon, without mentioning it anywhere in the published book, has edited and abridged the novel to suit the taste of a primary Western readership. The famous Malayalam writer and professor of English, my friend Ayyappa Panikar, declared that about 1/4 of the original had been left out. However, the translation of the novel Chemmeen, made by Narayana Menon, was received enthusiastically in English-speaking countries. Then something amusing happened. Translations of other novels by Thagazhi Sivashankaran Pillai followed, but these translations were done by other translators, not by Narayana Menon. Because these translators' English was not as good as that of Narayana Menon, on the one hand, these translations did not sell well in the market, and on the other hand, they gave the impression as if the literary quality of Thagazhi's works had declined. What is the present scenario in India when it comes to translations and discussions on translations? Let me make now, people who know me, they won't be surprised. But who people are listening to me for the first time, I'm giving them this message. Let me now make these not so comfortable, but hopefully thought-provoking remarks. Today, the academic circle at the universities in India, most of them are enthusiastically talking about translation techniques and translation theories, which come mainly from the European and North American culture and are often imported to India by the anglicized, Europeanized Indian intellectuals without having to pay any customs duty. Interestingly, in this atmosphere of a certain internationalism, most of the discussions take place not in an Indian language, but in English. Despite continuing discussions on translating, translation, translators, translation techniques, translation theories out in the wider world and in the anglicized intellectual circles in India, Indians at large still seem to retain the traditional concepts of Anuvad and Rupant. You will be able to understand this if you look at the way songs are transcreated when the same movie is produced in different Indian languages using the unique linguistic possibilities and cultural norms offered by the target language. I want to give you one example and I hope I'm successful in doing it. Let me see. The famous movie Roja. It was produced in Tamil first. The song went in Tamil like this. Chinna chinna aasai, siragadikum aasai, muttu muttu aasai, mudithu vaitha aasai, வெண்ணிலவு தொட்டு முத்தமிட ஆசை என்னை இந்த பூமி சுற்றி வர ஆசை. The Hindi version said something different. It said, दिल है छोटा सा छोटी सी आशा मस्ती भरे मन की बोली सी आशा चांद तारों को छूने की आशा आसमान में उड़ने की आशा. That is transcreation. So, in India, the scenario of literary translation is quite unique. And in a way, it is also grotesque. While the Indians, thanks to their knowledge of English, a language which was forced on them, and do have access to the literatures of foreign languages such as French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Russian. Many of us belong to this category. But many of us also have little access to literary works in various Indian languages. If you are asked to list the names of English poets and writers, you will be quickly able to write down at least 10 names. You may do the same thing if you have been dealing with French or German or Italian or Spanish or Russian. But try to sit down and write down names of 10 Indian poets and authors, not from your languages. Try that once and see what happens. Although, see what happens then, I can only tell you, to borrow the words of Jaishankar Prasad, once you try that, you will realize something very important and then tell yourself, oh God, I know hardly anything about Indian literatures. And then you may quote Jaishankar Prasad from his Asu, Ganibhut Pida Jyoti Mastak Mein Smriti Si Chai, घनीभूत पीड़ा ज्योति मस्तक में स्मृति सी छाई, दुर्दिन में आंसू बनकर वह आज बरसने आई. Now, although there is an official encouragement to translate amongst the Indian languages, the majority of translation activity is from Indian languages into English. Besides the linguistic hierarchy, what is at work here are the forces of the marketplace, whereby an English translation ensures greater visibility for the work outside its regional locale, within India and even outside India. Moreover, translators who have the linguistic competence to translate effectively between two or more Indian languages are also on the decline. You don't find many of them today. Most of the translations between the two Indian languages are mediated by an English translation, with English ironically becoming the link. This also effectively makes them more of retellings than faithful translation as it had been in the past. We have an Academy of Literature called Sahitya Academy in India, which was established in 1947 with the goal to promote Indian literatures by setting and nurturing high literary standards. The literary activities in the various Indian languages are supported by the Sahitya Academy. They are doing their best by each year giving awards to the best literary works in every Indian language. In this way, thanks to the Sahitya Academy, the Indian readers come to know each year by name at least one literary work and the name of one author who created it in Indian language. To a limited extent, Sahitya Academy supports translations of literary works from one Indian language to another. But these are not made directly from the original into the other Indian language, but via an English version, which is provided as a uniform base version to the translators from all Indian languages. So, these literary works are translated from one Indian language into another Indian language, very often through English. What comes out will be called in a South Indian Iyengar family home, second decoction coffee. In seminars and conferences on Indian literatures, many times discussions take place only in English. It's a sad fact that most literary works in various Indian languages are not interconnected through translations so that these works are accessible to the entire Indian population. Therefore, many discussions about Indian literatures among the Anglicized Indians are taking place in a vacuum. They don't realize it. And it can be quite frustrating. Indians are known worldwide for their tolerance and goodwill. They keep their windows with the English and European and American frames to the whole world. They keep these windows to look at non-Indian literatures widely open. But they keep the intermediate doors within the house called India tightly shut when it comes to exchange between Indian literatures. It is grotesque that the Anglicized and pseudo-Europeanized and Americanized Indians, not knowing Sanskrit, can read religious, and literary works of the Sanskrit language, and also many works of the Indian languages only in English through the translations done by Europeans. That is, you're looking at your own culture through the contact lenses of somebody else. The bitter truth is that most of these translations, including, I'm taking the risk of saying this, the bitter truth is that most of these translations, including those done by the famous Max Mueller, whom the Indians glorify, like many also glorify Hitler, don't ask me why. These translations are not flawless and they do contain certain serious mistakes. We now have a generation of young, educated Indians proudly proclaiming, "We speak English at home." Many of them are not well versed in their own mother tongue. Many of them can only speak the mother tongue, but they can't read and write it. In spite of all this achievement, we in India were and are, in spite of all the achievement of the Indian culture, we in India were and are enamored by whatever came from Europe, considering that to be superior to our own knowledge and wisdom. A tendency that continues even today, even among the so-called well-educated academicians and intellectuals. The colonial mindset continues to exist today in every sphere of life, particularly amongst the younger generation, without they realizing it. The younger generation is getting Americanized in the corporate culture. This has led to our education system losing its roots and heading towards a dead end, and that is why some people in the country thought we need a new education policy. As someone rightly pointed out, the so-called educated Indian has been forced to ignore his own language and culture, accept without reflecting over the problem everything and anything and everything which comes from the West as something superior. The Indian teachers and educators, particularly at institutes of higher education, or in their interaction with Europe and America, many of them, they are in a relationship of intellectual subordination. Even in the case of Indian languages and literatures, they have been now also appropriated by this crowd. Even in the case of Indian languages and literatures, any kind of research in them have been appropriated by the departments of English, who generously use imported terms like post-colonialism, deconstruction, etc., instead of putting efforts to relocate the Indian mind in the Indian thoughts in the Indian literatures. I know cases where at a very famous university in India, in the English department, research is being carried about a Malayalam translation of a Hindi novel. Okay. Now, neither the candidate knows Malayalam nor Hindi, nor the supervisor. They are operating with English translations. I don't know what they're doing. In the present day India, when we talk of translation, we blindly depend on Western concepts and theories, thereby neglecting the concept of transcreation of the Indian tradition. I think that transcreation needs a punarjanma in the Indian academic circles. What we are doing is like eating samosa, not with chutney, but only with ketchup, and eating idli sambar with fork and knife. One should not overlook the fact that countries like India, I'm coming to the end, one should not overlook the fact that countries like India, China, Japan, and the Arab world, particularly Egypt, do have their own tradition, indigenous thoughts about languages as effective tools in the cross-cultural human interaction. When one takes a closer look at the cultures of these countries and what they can offer, one would realize that these traditions do surpass in many aspects some of the thinking and theories from Europe claiming unjustly universal validity. It's indeed sad that the traditions of non-European cultures are practically ignored while discussing problems of language literature within the framework of comparative literature at European universities and even at academic discussions, supposedly with a cross-cultural approach. Let us never forget one thing. India never looked for the world. The world looked for India and forced us into a conversation according to its own norms, which we are continuing even today, thanks also to the colonialism and now globalization. Look at all your geographical terms. They call it Far East, we call it Far East. But Japan and China are not far away from us. They call it Middle East, we call it Middle East. They call it Eastern Europe, we call it Eastern Europe. But everything starting from Pakistan is on our west. So what is this Middle East we are talking about? Think about it. It's time for all of us to critically reflect on the responsibilities of specialists in languages, literature, culture, and teachers who teach these academic disciplines in countries which are being globalized, and India is one of them. The bitter truth is that, this is my idiosyncratic definition, you may not like it. The bitter truth is that if colonialism was the rule by foreigners by force, globalization is the rule by foreigners by invitation. Let me conclude with two small stories. Two policemen at the Times Square in New York are approached by a tourist. Two policemen at the Times Square in New York are approached by the tourist. Parlez-vous français? The tourist asks them. The two policemen just stare and say nothing. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? The tourist is asking. Both the policemen just stare at him and say nothing. Fala Português? The tourist asks. Both the policemen just stare at him and say nothing. Parlate Italiano? The tourist asks. Both the policemen just stare at him and say nothing. Finally, the tourist gives up and goes away. One policeman turns to the other one and says, "Hey, see, that fellow could speak 4 languages." The other policeman smiled and said, "So what? Did it help him?" The next story. There is the story of a Zen master, Buddhist Zen master, who went to New York for the first time. While he was walking on the streets, he felt hungry and therefore bought a hot dog. The Zen master gave the hot dog vendor, he asked the hot dog vendor, "How much is it?" He said, $2. The Zen master gave the hot dog vendor a $10 note and ate the hot dog. And the hot dog vendor asked the Zen master, "So, you liked it?" The Zen master said, "Yeah, it's very tasty." And then the hot dog vendor said, "Oh, I'm happy to hear that. Have a nice day." Since the vendor did not return any money, because the Zen master had given him $10, he got a little worried. So he asked the hot dog vendor, "Hey, you said it's $2. He said, "Yes, sir." "I gave you $10. He said, "Yes, sir." "What about the change?" the Zen master asked the hot dog vendor. The hot dog vendor smiled at the Zen master and said cheekily, "Sir, change? Well, you are the great Zen master. You should know it better, sir. I'm only a hot dog vendor. Sir, the change always comes from within." I hope my talk did provide you all something to seriously reflect on literary translations from a cross-cultural perspective. Let us not forget something. But this I have to say it only in German, because as I told you, some things should not be translated. So let me say this in German and then conclude. This is my conviction, Überzeugung. Over the years, wenn es eine interkulturelle Partnerschaft zwischen Menschen aus 2 verschiedenen Kulturen und Ländern geht, ich wiederhole, wenn es eine interkulturelle Partnerschaft zwischen Menschen aus 2 verschiedenen Kulturen und Ländern geht und dabei aber Die bittere Realität ist so, dass der eine Partner ist und der andere nur schafft, dann ist das keine ausgewogene interkulturelle Partnerschaft. Thank you very much and continue to have a nice day. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ganeshan, for a talk that was, I would say, freewheeling in one sense. It was very, very rich in references. I think we all appreciate the fact that the several references made to works of Indian literature and transcreations and the processes of transcreation within Indian literatures. I think those are very important markers for the Digital Translation Academy as such. It is also, if I may use the word, it's also a little bit polemical, also in a sense that provocative. Some of the remarks that Professor, but that is, I think, with Professor Ganeshan, for those of us who know him, and it is along expected lines that he will make us think, he will make us take a position, and he will provoke us into a discussion many a time. I will just maybe recollect a few points that struck me as I listened to Professor Ganeshan's talk, and also maybe ask one or two questions of him. Very, very aptly, it was, as he himself said, he's not a person of theory, but a one of praxis. I think the entire lecture was, it was evident that it was a man of praxis who was speaking throughout this lecture. I particularly liked I mean, there are, of course, the metaphors that he always uses, which he called Tamil his eyes and other languages different contact lenses through which he views the world. And one of the things that that he mentioned early on was the fact that the word translation, which is of course of Latin origin, it has, when one renders the word itself into Indian languages, there are various possibilities, and most of these possibilities, inherent in most of these possibilities, is a sense of transcreation. I think that was a very important point that was mentioned by Professor Ganeshan early on. It is like, it is to me, although I'm going to quote a Western thinker here, but this is not, I hope it is not borrowed wisdom, but I think it is for me in a sense. When we have discussed during the workshops in the context of this academy, we have discussed the work of Walter Benjamin, and it was in that sense a weiterleben, a living on of something which was the original in its new forms. I mean, it is so this fact that the Indian transcreations or Indian transcreationists or translators are not really that obsessed with the source text or the original, and in fact are more responsible towards the quote unquote target language. I think that's a very important point for us to ponder. And so it is not a docile transfer of meaning from one language to another, but a truly a transcreation. And the examples given are many. I think there is also the more than 300 Ramayanas, the famous essay of Ramanujam's, and so on and so forth. There are several examples of this. And Professor Ganeshan himself brought up Namdev, Swati Tirunal, then Sarfoji, of course, Sarfoji, and Mirabai are examples. I would even bring Kabir, for example, into this, and how Kabir is transcreated is a fabulous example, because the bijak itself is very, very limited in its entire oeuvre or its entire scope. The bijak is limited, but the way Kabir lives in oral traditions, it's I mean, I'm quoting an example from a film on Kabir which I watched, where people are discussing the fact that in a Kabir composition, apparently, there is something like Ram Naam ki ticket kata lo. So how will you Ram Naam ki ticket kataofy? You know, that kind of a thing. But it is there. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, perhaps that the rasa that is sought to be conveyed or recreated. I mean, the person who is singing that song, probably on a train somewhere, is aware of that. Also, the example of Vairagya that you gave was very, pardon the pun, but enlightening. So this is these are some of the points. Going further, I think it was it was um, it comes to the fact that the Anuvadak, as the translator, has both a tremendous amount of freedom to transcreate as well as a responsibility towards the fact, towards the act of their mediation. The translator is the mediator, and that particular location the translator gives or places a tremendous amount of responsibility to the translator, while also according them uh, freedom to transcreate. Now, my question to Professor Ganeshan in this regard is, can this be conceptualized, or is it only intuitive? Or is it only that the translator has to intuit what the responsibility and what the freedom is? Or is it because you're talking in the context of a translation academy, I'm asking whether this particular point, which is very important, that that the translator has to reach a balance between responsibility to the texts, both texts, to target as well as the source text, and the freedom to transcreate, whether it can be conceptualized, and whether one has to entirely accept the possibly or the fact that it is in fact only intuition that can work here. So that is one of the questions. I will just finish a few more points, which are very thought-provoking and provocative. Uh, I think one of the references to the literary critic being the Sarodaya is very, very important. And I will again quote a Western source for this, which is, I mean, it is a hermeneutic basis of the very interpersonal, I would say, but also intertextual relationships that evolved over centuries. That there is a hermeneutic basis to that, hermeneutic basis to that, which is to put it in a nutshell, to place oneself into the shoes of the other and look at the world from those eyes before one embarks upon the task of translating. Of course, the references to the Ramayana and Mahabharata, including Kamba Ramayana and several Mahabharata versions. I mean, there are so many Mahabharata versions which are not even written, which are simply performed in several corners of India and in several languages, where the basic skeletal story is there, but there are so many different the accent shifts, the focus shifts, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's very important for us to understand this diversity of our. I'm saying our because I'm not comfortable with the word our, but I'm saying our in Anführungszeichen or in quote unquote, because I really feel that we have to move beyond the intercultural paradigm to a transcultural paradigm. That is what I believe in. So I am not in tune with interculturality. So I'm placing the word our in quotations, but I think it is important for us to consider the rich diversity of our quote unquote traditions as a value in itself. That is a value in itself. It is not something that is instrumental, but it is a value in itself. Sorry, where have I gone? Yeah, then it's important that Professor Ganeshan also mentioned that Sanskrit is not the only Indian tradition. There are so many different traditions. I think that is what I meant by also the fact that we have to understand this diversity as a value in itself. Then, with the advent of the British, I think the act of translation became instrumentalized. I think that would be the word that I would use, where the translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Wilkins or of which was the other one that was mentioned anyway, in the 1780s, those translations were meant to serve a purpose, a very instrumental purpose of getting to know a people that was to be dominated and that was to be exploited. So that is that instrumentalization of translation is something that. And then he also mentioned Bharatendu's, for example, the Indian recreation of English texts. Tagore's Gitanjali and the translation and the entire discourse between him and Yeats. We have had Hans Harder speak about it in this very lecture series, and Hans Harder has worked on his on Tagore's translations as well, and that also is a very, very interesting uh, phenomenon of self-translation, and how Tagore himself uh, he himself kind of censored himself when he translated for the West from his own work, from Gitanjali. Then coming to Professor Ganeshan's uncomfortable or not so comfortable remarks and this thing. I mean, the academics are talking of theories and techniques borrowed from the West, but I would differ with him on that. We are not only talking about theories and concepts borrowed from the West. Even if we were, I would think it is not invalid. I think if one is aware of the fact that that in oneself there is a lack of having a conversation with one's own quote unquote tradition. But still, I mean, historically speaking, we are placed in a context where, or we're placed in a situation where we have to work with what we have. Okay, so that does not invalidate the entire discourse of Indian academia. However, I agree that there is need uh, to rejuvenate our connections and bring Indian literatures and not just Sanskrit literature into the academic discourse much more intensively. I agree on that point. Because I don't think it is only intellectual subordination that we're talking about. I think there is also a genuine engagement with the West, and it always reflects back upon, if you engage with the other, it reflects back upon yourself if you're truly engaging with the other. Then the mention of Sahitya Akademi is okay. That was also, I think, the second decoction in a Tamil household was second decoction coffee was another metaphor that stays. I have quite, I mean, again, but when you came to the conclusion of your talk, Professor Ganeshan, you also talked about the Indian mind. Now, I mean, I find that a problematic uh, concept. Or I mean, what is the Indian mind? There are so many Indian traditions. There are so many Indian languages. How many Indians, for example, knew Sanskrit or no Sanskrit? Even knew Sanskrit earlier when it was whenever it was the primary literary language. Only if it was the only literary language. So that is something that I'm not very comfortable with the with in the Indian context, as in the context of the world, we need to talk about uh, um, we talk in plural terms, Indian literatures and not Indian literature, or Indian traditions and not tradition, and so on and so forth. And one last, so I have basically, I hope, sir, that those two questions I have mentioned in between, which I could repeat if you want, but also the last point about the Middle East. There again, I would like to say that officially, officially, India refers to the Middle East as West Asia and not as the Middle East. So there is a concerted effort on the part of the Indian state also to alter the colonial influence on that we are under. And one of the manifestations of this, very simple one, but it is there, that, for example, in diplomatic language, Indian diplomacy refers to the Middle East as West Asia. And so in JNU, for example, you have a Center for West Asian Studies and not one for Middle Eastern Studies. So that is that was my response to, again, a most thought-provoking. And as I said, I mean, when you listen to Professor Ganeshan, you have to respond in the sense that so my task today was not that difficult in the sense that, but I had to keep track of all that he was saying. That was all. So with this, I come to the end of my response. And Professor Ganeshan, would you like me to recap the two questions, or is it okay?
Yeah. Can I respond now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So first of all, I'm feeling very happy because if I've been able to provoke a person like Milind, my job has been done. And thanks for all your comments. And to start with, what is Indian mind? That's precisely my point. There's no one Indian mind. You see, there are problems between North India and South India also right now. Okay, there's no one Indian mind. There is 1 billion Indian minds. And this pluralism, as far as the language is concerned, culture is concerned, religion is concerned, faith is concerned, I want my Mahan Bharat to be like that. So I don't want anything to be put into a norm and say that this is what everybody has to follow. I mean, that's one thing I want to tell you. And the second thing, at random, I'll tell you certain things. One is, I'll come to the concept right at the end, maybe. You were talking about Kabir, that's right. A lot of Kabir's Doha, for example, they can be also recreated for today's world. And two of them would be, according to me, there is one Kabir ka Doha, kal kare so aaj kar, aaj kare so ab, pal mein parlay hoega, bahuri karega kab. Now, if you apply it to the problems you have in many of the government offices when you have to get some documents and all, Kabir would have written it in a different way. He'll say, aaj kare so kal kare so parson, fikr hai kis baat ki, naukri hai barson. Another one would be, Mala to karme fire, jeeb fire mukmahi, manwa to das disa fire, ye to sumarin nahi. I take the liberty of telling the younger generation in a lighter vein, cell phone to karme fire, jeeb fire mukmahi, manwa to das disa fire, ye to communication nahi. Now, you are talking about the what you called transcultural. That is exactly what I'm also trying to say. See, the point is, you said about West Asia. Yes, that's a diplomatic language. But in the language of the common man, even the schools, they talk about Middle East. You see, that's a problem. You see, these things have to reach the common people, and it should become part of their vocabulary. There's sometimes a difference in the jargon which we use and the language the people use. That's what is worrying me a bit, particularly with the younger generation, which doesn't seem to be reflecting on too many things. Like you see, if you want to dig into, if you want to be extreme, then of course you can take the stand that, of course, India had everything before the world. I'm not saying that. But, just in a lighter vein, we talk of the alienation effect. Brecht, episches theater. The alienation effect you always had in the Indian theaters, village theaters, where they will play Ramayana, and the fellow who is playing Ravan, he plays the bad guy, but in an interval, he will come out and smoke a BD with the audience. That's alienation, actually. But in any case, now this transcultural, you're right, I agree, but we have been always thinking of everything as a trans thing, not, mine and yours. I didn't mean that exactly. Maybe it didn't come through, because after all, this is the country which has the concept of Ardhanarishwar, you see, which is both in one. So a globalized citizen should have both in him, his culture as well as the other culture, and assimilate it together and create a harmony. That's what I'm looking for. As a Hindu, I'm hopeful because I have a lot of punarjan. If I would be of some other faith, maybe my story will end today. That's it. And so conceptualizing, yes, I agree with you absolutely. What you said is correct. The problem in India is, some people may not like it again. We talk a lot, but when it comes to action, we don't do anything. After every conference, every seminar, we do resolutions we pass. But how many of them we follow up? Take even the government. They appoint a committee. The committee meets, takes certain decisions. Okay, then the report is given to the government. Nothing happens after that. After 1 year, the government will reappoint the committee. The reappointed committee will reiterate the decisions taken earlier. I mean, this is a problem which I've been facing throughout my life. So we'll have to find something where we have to make sure that what we preach, we practice. What we practice, we preach. And action has to follow the thought. And therefore, yes, all these thoughts which are floating around, even the transcreation, it would be good if we can put them into a concept, so that people who are entering the activity of translation, who may not know anything about that, they get some kind of guideline that these are the things they should try to follow. This is something I must honestly and modestly tell you, this is what I try to do in my workshops, which I conducted for the Tamil translators. Because they expressed their inability, they had some problems. So I discussed them what is a literary translation, what is the role of the translator, what is the connection between the original text, target language, and things like that. So this is something which, as a follow-up action, I would be very happy if the academy does it, and it can be done. It's not that it can't be done. I hope that it is done. I'm looking forward to that. Okay. And the last thing I want to tell you is that Milind does have other kind of opinions about certain things I said. That is perfectly all right with me. That's perfectly all right with me, because lifelong, it's a learning process. I keep on learning even today. And I also get a lot of impulse, and from people when they start discussing with me. But what is important for me is, it is quite, see, it will be sad if we won't have difference of opinion.
Correct.
We will keep on only saying, amen. Now, before the feminist protest, let me say, women or hallelujah all the time. So I only hope that in spite of all the discussions we have, we can always tell each other, unsere Ansichten gehen als Freunde auseinander. That's what I want. Thank you.
Thanks. Milind, you had raised your hand. Yeah.
One very quick point when Professor Ganeshan was talking about laying down some guidelines for translators, and especially for literary translators. I think one of the things that we got out of today's talk, even though it was perhaps not intended, but I think that is something that we should look for, is the number of references. I think that is something that we need to keep in mind, and that there is, there is, and the more the references, the better it is in terms of an activity such as translation. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Professor Ganeshan, and thank you everyone for the participation. I'm giving it back to Jayashree now to conclude.
So this was supposedly the last lecture in the series of the Translation Academy, but we are actually starting a new journey with the word or the term transcreation. Thank you for that thought, and thank you for other insightful references, Dr. Ganeshan. There are many comments in the meeting chat box. People have thanked you for this thought-provoking lecture, insightful lecture, etc., etc. There are many questions in the minds of many other participants. I request them to write to you directly. I have mentioned your email. And I'm sure we are going to meet again in this journey of translation, transcreation, transculturalization, or interculturating references, etc., etc. Because Goethe-Institut is committed to translations from German into various South Asian languages. We will take this forward and in January, and this academy will conclude in January, but maybe something else will emerge out of this kind of intellectual discourses. Thank you very much. Schönes Restwochenende, and we meet again.
Jayashree,
Yes,
I
sir.
have a request.
Yes,
Can you please cut and paste the chat and send it to me? And as you rightly said, anybody has any questions which we could not take up, please write to me.
Yeah.
Send me an email.
Yes.
I'll answer
Sure.
your question.
Yeah.
And I want to thank Jayashree for all the effort she has put in right from the beginning. I remember our first conversation in the context of the project, and till today, the way she has been putting in efforts and working very, very hard, not hardly. And I don't know what I can give her as a compliment. I don't find any words in any of the 10 languages which I know. The only thing I can tell her is, while people may tend to keep on saying Jai Shri Krishna in India, I will continue to say Jai Shri, Jai Shri. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I will also say Jai Shri and Mansi, because without Mansi's support, this wouldn't have been possible at all. So let's also give a round of applause for Mansi this time.
Sure, sure.
Till then, schönes Restwochenende, and until we meet again in 2024.